At 78 years old, Vernon "Vern" Wilkins sits alone in his cold apartment, staring at an empty refrigerator. His stomach growls with familiar hunger. Once an assistant coach for the Chicago Bulls who helped shape Michael Jordan's legendary shooting form, Vern now counts saltine crackers and decides which is more important, heart medication or heat. His pension barely covers rent on his rundown apartment, and the eviction notice is just days away. The walls around him tell a different story. Photographs of championship teams, newspaper clippings of basketball glory, and one special picture showing a young Vern standing beside Michael Jordan, teaching him the perfect shooting technique. Elbow in, follow through, trust the arc. When a young sports reporter discovers Vern's dire situation and publishes his story, it goes viral overnight. Former players rally with donations, but Vern's pride won't let him accept what he sees as charity. Then comes an unexpected phone call from a deep, familiar voice Vern hasn't heard in over 20 years. "Coach, why didn't you call me?" asks Michael Jordan. "We need to talk, face to face." No one could have predicted what happens next. As Jordan's private jet touches down, he arrives with more than just a check. He has a plan that will change everything, not just for Vern, but for countless young basketball players for generations to come. The greatest player in basketball history is about to make the greatest assist of his life. The winter chill seeped through the thin walls of apartment 4B, but Vernon "Vern" Wilkins barely noticed anymore. His fingers, once quick enough to snap instructions to the fastest players in basketball, now trembled as he pulled his old Chicago Bulls coaching jacket tighter around his bony shoulders. "Just like the old days," Vern whispered to the empty room. Except colder. Vern's eyes drifted across his small living room walls, covered with photographs that told the story of a different life. Newspaper clippings, team photos, and candid shots from practices long forgotten by everyone except him. His gaze settled on one photo in particular, a young Michael Jordan, all lean muscle and determined eyes, standing next to a younger version of himself. Vern's finger traced the glass covering the picture, wiping away a thin layer of dust. "We were something back then, weren't we, Mike?" Vern said, his voice catching. In the photo, his arm was around Jordan's shoulders, both of them grinning after a successful shooting drill. Vern remembered that day in 1984 like it was yesterday. Jordan had stayed 2 hours after practice, determined to perfect the shooting form Vern had suggested. "Elbow in, follow through, trust the arc," Vern murmured, the words so familiar they felt carved into his soul. A loud growl from his stomach interrupted the memory. Vern hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, a single piece of toast with the last scraping of peanut butter from the jar. He shuffled to his small kitchen, each step accompanied by the tap of his cane against the worn linoleum floor. The refrigerator hummed loudly, working too hard to cool too little. When Vern opened it, the empty shelves stared back at him. Half, a carton of milk, probably spoiled, a single egg, some ketchup packets he'd taken from a fast food restaurant last week. "Dinner of champions," Vern said with a sad smile, closing the door without taking anything. At 78 years old, his body felt every one of those years, and then some. The stroke 3 years ago had left him with a limp and trembling hands. His coaching days were long behind him. The pension that had seemed adequate when he retired barely covered the rent on this rundown one-bedroom apartment now, let alone food, medicine, and heat. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet apartment. Vern knew who it was before he even picked up. "Hello?" he said, trying to sound stronger than he felt. "Mr. Wilkins, it's Doug from Property Management." The voice on the other end was trying to sound professional, but Vern could hear the impatience underneath. "I'm calling about your rent. You're 2 weeks late again." Vern closed his eyes, his free hand gripping his cane tighter. "I know, Doug. I'm sorry. My Social Security check was delayed this month. I should have it by Friday." It was a lie. The check had come, but it had barely covered his heart medication and the electric bill. "Mr. Wilkins, this is the 3rd month in a row. The lottery owner is losing patience. I understand. I just need a little more time." There was a sigh on the other end. "I can give you 1 week, that's it. After that, we'll have to start eviction proceedings." The words hit Vern like a physical blow. 1 week. I understand. Thank you, Doug. Don't thank me. Just pay your rent, Doug said before hanging up. Vern carefully placed the phone back in its cradle. His hands were shaking worse now. Eviction. The word hung in the air like a storm cloud. Where would he go? What would he do with all his memories, his photographs? His eyes drifted back to the photo of him and Jordan. 23 years old, already showing signs of greatness, but still raw, still needing guidance on his form, his release point. Vern had spent countless hours with him, tweaking, adjusting, encouraging. "Shooting is just physics and faith," he used to tell Jordan. "I'll teach you the physics. The faith part is all." You! Vern hadn't spoken to Michael Jordan in over 20 years. Their paths had diverged after Vern left the Bulls to coach high school basketball in his hometown. Jordan went on to become a legend, the greatest to ever play the game. Vern went on to shape young minds and bodies, finding joy in the small victories of high school sports. And now here he was, hungry, cold, about to be homeless. In his wallet, tucked behind his expired driver's license, was a phone number, Jordan's private line given to him years ago during a chance meeting at a basketball camp. "Call anytime, Coach," Jordan had said with that famous smile. "I owe you more than you know." Vern had never called. His pride wouldn't let him. His stomach growled again, louder this time. The hunger was a constant companion now, a gnawing emptiness that made it hard to think straight sometimes. Vern looked at the clock on the wall, a Bulls logo in the center, another relic from his past. 6:42 p.m. Too early for bed, but what else was there to do? Sitting up took energy, and energy required food. Vern made his way to his bedroom, passing more photos on the wall. Him with his high school championship team from 1998. Him and his late wife Marlene on their 40th anniversary, 5 years before cancer took her. His daughter Tanya at her college graduation. He'd call Tanya tomorrow, their weekly check-in. He'd lie again about how he was doing just fine. She had her own family to worry about, her own bills to pay. 3 kids and a husband who'd been laid off twice in the last year. She couldn't help him, and he'd never ask. As Vern lowered himself onto his bed, still wearing his Bulls jacket, his eyes caught the gleam of his championship ring from the Bulls' first title run. He'd earned that ring, been part of something special. "Glory days," Vern whispered to himself as he pulled the thin blanket up to his chin. Outside, snow began to fall, adding another layer of cold to a world that had already turned so cold to Vernon Wilkins, the man who once helped shape the shot of the greatest basketball player who ever lived. Sleep didn't come easy that night. It never did anymore. Vern's mind drifted back to the day he left the Bulls, back in 1987. The head coach job at Riverdale High School had opened up, and Marlene had wanted to move back to their hometown. "Let's raise Tanya somewhere quiet," she'd said. "Somewhere. We can put down roots." Chicago had been exciting, working with pros, being part of something big. But Marlene was right. She usually was. NBA life meant constant travel, late nights, and missing his daughter's first steps, first words, first everything. So Vern had taken the high school job, shaken hands with the Bulls management, and said goodbye to the pros forever. His last day, Jordan had given him a Bulls jacket. "So you don't forget us, coach," he'd said, with that $1,000,000 smile. As if Vern could ever forget. The morning light crept through the thin curtains, waking Vern from his fitful sleep. His joints ached more than usual, a combination of the cold and sleeping in one position too long. Getting old wasn't for the weak. Vern checked his phone. No missed calls, no messages, just the blank screen staring back at him. He thought about his daughter Tanya. Would today be the day he finally told her the truth? That her father, once respected and comfortable, was now facing eviction? That he had to choose between medicine and food most months? No, he couldn't do that to her. She worried enough already. 30 years at Riverdale High had been good ones. Vern had coached hundreds of kids, won a few state championships, and most importantly, changed lives. Not all his players went on to college ball. Most didn't. But they learned about teamwork, discipline, and believing in themselves. The real lessons of sports had nothing to do with scoring points. Defense wins games, character wins life, he used to tell them. Some kids rolled their eyes. Others took it to heart. The trophy case at Riverdale still had his picture in it. Coach Vern Wilkins, the winningest coach in school history. What would those kids think if they could see him? Now, Vern forced himself out of bed. His stomach cramped with hunger, but he ignored it. He'd gotten good at that. In the bathroom, he avoided looking in the mirror as he brushed his teeth. He didn't need to see the gaunt face, the sunken eyes. He knew what hunger looked like. Instead, his mind wandered back to 2012, the beginning of the end. Marlene had been tired for weeks. Just tired, she said. Nothing serious, but Vern had insisted she see a doctor. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer was the diagnosis. 6 months to live was the sentence. She'd made it 8 months. Fight her till the end, his Marlene. The medical bills came, fast and furious. Insurance covered some, but not all. Not even close to all. Vern had dipped into their savings, then drained it completely. He'd taken out a second mortgage on their small house. He'd cashed in his 401k, paying the penalty. Because what did it matter? Marlene needed the treatments, the comfort care, the chance at a few more days. After she died, Vern had sold the house. He had to. The mortgage payments were too much on just his pension. The money from the sale paid off the remaining medical bills, with just enough left over to afford the security deposit on his apartment. That was 10 years ago. 10 years of slowly sliding into poverty. 10 years of inflation eating away at his fixed income. 10 years of sometimes having to choose between heart medication and dinner. But life had still been manageable until the stroke. 3 years ago, Vern had been volunteering at a youth basketball camp when it hit. 1 minute he was demonstrating the proper follow-through on a jump shot. The next, he was on the floor, the left side of his body not responding to his brain's commands. The kids had screamed. The other coaches had called 911. Vern remembered none of it. What he did remember was waking up in the hospital 2 days later, his left side weak, his speech slurred. Tanya had been there, worry etched on her face. "Dad, you have to come live with us in California," she'd said, holding his hand. "No," he'd replied, the word coming out garbled but definite. Tanya had 3 kids under the age of 10. Her husband, Jeff's construction business, was struggling. The last thing they needed was an invalid father-in-law taking up space. So Vern had gone through rehab alone. He'd learned to walk again, though not without a cane. He'd regained most of his speech, but he couldn't coach anymore, couldn't demonstrate the proper shooting technique, couldn't move the way he needed to. The school had been kind. They'd held a retirement ceremony, named the gym after him. The Vern Wilkins Court, home of the Riverdale Rams. There had been a nice write-up in the local paper. Former players had come back to shake his hand, tell him what he'd meant to them. And then, like most retirees, he'd been largely forgotten. Now here he was, 3 years later, facing eviction. 1 week to come up with 3 months' back rent. An impossible task. Vern made his way to the kitchen, his cane thumping against the floor with each step. He opened the cupboard. A single packet of instant oatmeal and half a box of saltines stared back at him. The oatmeal would have to wait. He needed to make it last. He took out 2 saltines and ate them slowly, savoring each bland bite. His eyes drifted to the stack of bills on the counter. Electric, phone, the past due notice from the pharmacy for his heart medication, the final notice from the property management company. On the fridge, held by a Chicago Bulls magnate, was a photo of Tanya and her family taken last Christmas. They looked happy, if a bit strained around the eyes. Money troubles did that to a person. Vern knew that look all too well now. His weekly call with Tanya was scheduled for today. What would he tell her? That, in a week, he might be living on the street? That the great Coach Wilkins couldn't even afford a loaf of bread? No, he'd lie. Again. Tell her everything was fine. That the retirement community was keeping him busy with activities. That he'd made friends with the other residents. That he was eating well and taking his medicine. Lies upon lies to protect her from worry she didn't need. Vern's eyes drifted back to the photo of Jordan on the wall. The young superstar had gone on to make hundreds of millions of dollars. He'd become not just a basketball icon, but a global brand. Air Jordan, the Jumpman logo. A billionaire now, and here was Vern, rationing saltines. He'd never begrudged Jordan his success. The man had worked harder than anyone Vern had ever known. Had a drive that couldn't be taught. Vern had just been lucky enough to be there at the beginning, to help shape that raw talent in small ways. Elbow in, follow through, trust the arc, Vern murmured again, the teaching so ingrained it had become a mantra. His stomach growled loudly in the quiet apartment. 1 week until eviction. 7 days to figure out how to survive. Vern grabbed his cane and his thin wallet. Maybe the food bank. Maybe, if he could swallow his pride along with the hunger. The walk to St. Mary's Church was only 6 blocks, but to Vern, it felt like miles. Each step with his cane sent a jolt of pain up his bad leg. The sidewalks were slippery with fresh snow, and twice he nearly fell. By the time the red brick building came into view, Vern was breathing hard, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The sign out front read, St. Mary's Food Bank, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 10 a.m. 2 p.m. A small line of people waited outside the side entrance. Old people like him. Young mothers with small children. A few men who looked like they might be living on the streets. Vern stopped at the corner across the street. His stomach growled, reminding him why he'd come. But his feet wouldn't move forward. Couldn't move forward. Coach Wilkins? Vern turned to see a man in his 40s approaching with a grocery bag in his arms. It took a moment for Vern to place the face. Tommy Reese, the man said with a smile. Class of '98. You coached me on JV. Vern forced a smile. Tommy? Of course. How are you doing? Good, Coach. Real good. Working over at the factory now. Got 3 kids. Tommy shifted the grocery bag to his other arm. What brings you out in this weather? Vern's eyes darted to the food bank line, then back to Tommy. Just getting some fresh air. Tommy followed his gaze to the church. Understanding flashed across his face. You know, Coach, my mom uses that food bank sometimes. No shame in it. She says they're good people. Vern's cheeks burned, not from the cold. That's good to hear. I was just passing by. Tommy didn't look convinced. You need anything, Coach? I'm fine. Vern cut him off, his voice sharper than intended. Really? Enjoying retirement? An awkward silence fell between them. Tommy nodded finally. Well, it was good seeing you, Coach. You take care now. You too, Tommy. Vern watched his former player walk away. When Tommy was out of sight, Vern took one more look at the food bank line, then turned and started the long walk home. His legs felt heavier with each step. No, he wouldn't do it. Not today. He still had those saltines, the oatmeal packet. He would make it work. Back in his apartment, Vern shivered as he removed his thin coat. The heat was barely working again. He'd have to call the landlord, but that would just remind Doug about the overdue rent. Better to just add another layer of clothes. Vern put on the Bulls jacket over his sweater. It was old and a bit frayed at the cuffs, but still the warmest thing he owned. His refrigerator hummed loudly in the quiet apartment. Vern opened it, though he knew what he'd find. The single egg. The milk that was definitely spoiled now. Nothing else. Hunger was a living thing inside him, clawing at his insides. Vern closed the fridge and shuffled to the window. The snow was coming down harder now, blanketing the world in white. 2 blocks away was Eddie's Corner Market. Vern still had $17 in his wallet. Not much, but enough for bread. Maybe some peanut butter. Cheap things that would fill his stomach. The walk to Eddie's took twice as long in the snow. By the time Vern pushed open the door, the bell jingling overhead, he was exhausted. He leaned heavily on his cane as he made his way through the small store. A loaf of white bread, 1.89, a jar of peanut butter, 3.29, a package of ramen noodles, 10 for $2, some bananas at 59 cents each. He took 3. At the register, Eddie himself rang up the items. He was a man about Vern's age, though healthier looking. That'll be $9.65, Eddie said. Vern handed over a $10 bill, his hand shaking slightly. Eddie noticed. You doing okay, Vern? He asked, handing back the change. Just fine, Vern replied, the lie coming easily after so much practice. You know, Eddie said, lowering his voice, I got some day-old bread and pastries in the back. Perfectly. Good. Just can't sell 'em. Was gonna throw them out. You'd be doing me a favor taking them off my hands. Vern's pride flared. I don't need charity, Eddie. Eddie's face fell. Course not. Just thought I'd offer. Vern took his small bag of groceries and left without another word. The walk home felt even longer. Back in his apartment, Vern made himself a peanut butter sandwich. He ate it slowly, savoring each bite. It was the first real food he'd had in days, and his body thanked him for it. He drank tap water to wash it down. A knock at his door startled him. Vern wasn't expecting anyone. He made his way to the door and opened it to find Mrs. Grayson from across the hall, holding a covered dish. Evening, Vernon, she said with a warm smile. Her white hair was perfectly styled, her clothes neat despite their obvious age. I made a lasagna, and it's far too much for just me. I thought you might like some. Mrs. Grayson was a widow too. Her husband had died 5 years ago. She and Vern sometimes exchanged pleasantries in the hallway. She'd invited him for dinner before, but he'd always declined. "That's very kind, but I just ate," Vern said. "Mrs." Grayson glanced past him into the apartment. Vern knew what she saw: the emptiness, the cold, the signs of poverty he couldn't hide. "Well, you can heat it up tomorrow then," she said, holding out the dish. Vern hesitated. His pride said no. His stomach said yes. "Please, Vernon. Frank always loved my lasagna. I'd hate to see it go to waste." Frank had been a good man, a Korean War veteran. He and Vern had sometimes talked sports in the building's small lobby. "Thank you," Vern said finally, accepting the dish. It was warm in his hands, the smell making his mouth water despite the sandwich he'd just eaten. After Mrs. Grayson left, Vern sat in his chair, the lasagna on the TV tray beside him. His eyes burned with sudden tears. He couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for him. That night, as Vern cleaned the empty lasagna dish, he avoided looking at his reflection in the kitchen window. He didn't want to see the shame there, the fallen man he'd become. Alone in his bedroom, Vern took out his phone and looked at Jordan's number again. His thumb hovered over the call button. No, not yet. Maybe not ever. Some pride was all he had left. Vern woke to the sound of his phone ringing. He fumbled for it on the nightstand, nearly knocking it to the floor. The screen showed a number he didn't recognize. "Hello?" His voice was still thick with sleep. "Is this Vernon Wilkins? The basketball coach?" The voice was young, energetic, unfamiliar. "Former coach," Vern corrected. "Who's this?" "My name is Darius Jackson. I'm a sports reporter with the Tribune. I'm working on a series about the unsung heroes behind basketball legends. Your name came up when I was researching Michael Jordan's early years with the Bulls." Vern sat up straighter, suddenly more awake. "How'd you get my number?" "Tommy Reese gave it to me. I interviewed him for a story on local high school basketball. He spoke very highly of you." Tommy, the former player he'd run into near the food bank. Vern felt a flash of embarrassment, wondering if Tommy had told this reporter about seeing his old coach looking like he was about to stand in a charity line. "Mr. Wilkins, are you still there?" "Yes," Vern said, clearing his throat. "What exactly do you want?" "An interview about your time with the Bulls, specifically your work with Jordan. From what I understand, you were instrumental in developing his shooting technique early on." Vern almost laughed. "That's a stretch. Jordan had natural talent. I just helped him refine it a bit." "That's exactly the kind of perspective I'm looking for," Darius said eagerly. "The people behind the scenes who contributed to greatness without taking credit. Would you be willing to meet for an interview? It wouldn't take more than an hour or two." Vern was about to refuse when Darius added, "The paper pays $150 for featured interviews." $150, enough to buy groceries for a couple of weeks. Maybe enough to convince Doug to hold off on the eviction a little longer. "When did you have in mind?" Vern asked, trying to sound casual. "How about today? I could meet you for lunch. My treat. A free meal and $150. Vern's stomach rumbled at the thought. "Today works. There's a diner on Oakwood called Mel's. Know it? I'll find it. How's noon?" "Noon is fine." After hanging up, Vern moved slowly to the bathroom. He needed to look presentable, not like a man who was rationing saltines. He showered for the first time in days, the hot water a luxury he usually avoided to keep the bills down. He shaved carefully, nicking himself only once. His hands weren't as steady as they used to be. In the bedroom, Vern pulled out his one good outfit: navy slacks, a button-up shirt, and a blazer he'd worn to Marlene's funeral. They hung loose on his frame now. He'd lost too much weight. At 11:30, Vern began the walk to Mel's diner. The snow had stopped, but the sidewalks were still slick. He took his time, not wanting to fall and ruin his clean clothes. Mel's was a throwback to the 1950s, with red vinyl booths and chrome accents. Vern used to bring Marlene here for Friday night dinners in better times. The hostess, a young woman Vern didn't recognize, showed him to a booth by the window. "Can I get you something to drink while you wait?" she asked. "Just water," Vern replied. He would wait for Darius before ordering food. No sense in risking having to pay for his own meal if the reporter didn't show. But Darius did show, right on time. He was younger than Vern had expected, probably in his mid-20s. Black, with short dreadlocks and rectangular glasses that gave him a scholarly look. He extended his hand to Vern. "Mr. Wilkins, thank you for meeting me. I'm Darius Jackson." Vern shook his hand. "Call me Vern." After they settled in and ordered a club sandwich for Darius, the cheapest breakfast special for Vern, despite it being lunchtime, Darius took out a small recorder. "Do you mind if I record our conversation? It helps me get the quotes right." Vern nodded his permission, and Darius pressed a button on the device. "So, tell me about how you first came to work with Michael Jordan." For the next hour, Vern found himself transported back to the mid-1980s. He told stories about Jordan's early days with the Bulls, the endless practice sessions, the determination, the raw talent that needed just a bit of refinement. "His work ethic was unlike anything I'd ever seen," Vern said, warming to the subject. "Most guys, you tell them to take 100 shots, they take 100. You tell Jordan to take 100, he takes 500. Until it's perfect." "And you worked specifically on his shooting form?" Darius asked, scribbling notes alongside the recording. "That was my specialty, yes. I'd been a decent shooter in college, nothing special, but I studied the mechanics. The physics of it. I could break down a jump shot the way some people can break down an engine." "What specifically did you work on with Jordan?" Vern demonstrated with his hands, muscle memory taking over. His elbow was drifting out. "Not much, just a few degrees. But in basketball, a few degrees at the release point means missing by feet at the basket. We worked on keeping that elbow in, extending through the shot, trusting the arc." Vern realized Darius was studying him intently, not just his words, but his appearance. He suddenly felt self-conscious about his too big clothes, the way his collar hung loose around his neck. "And after the Bulls, you coached high school, right?" Darius asked, changing directions. 30 years at Riverdale High," Vern confirmed. "Not as glamorous as the NBA, but rewarding in its own way. And now, how are you enjoying retirement?" The question hung in the air. Vern took a sip of water to buy time. Should he lie, like he did to Tanya? Pretend everything was fine? But something about Darius's direct gaze made Vern hesitate. "Retirement has its challenges," he said finally. Darius turned off the recorder. "Off the record, Vern. Are you okay? You seem..." He trailed off, not wanting to say the obvious. For a moment, Vern considered maintaining the facade. But what was the point? He was too tired, too hungry to keep pretending. "Times are tough," he admitted. "My pension doesn't go as far as it used to?" Darius nodded slowly. "I thought so. Tommy mentioned you might be struggling." So, Tommy had said something. Vern felt a flash of embarrassment, quickly replaced by resignation. "I'd like to come see your place," Darius said. "Take some photos of you with your Bulls memorabilia. The Tribune pays extra for photo features." "How much extra?" Vern asked. The question blunt, in a way that would have mortified him a year ago. Another 100 on top of the interview fee. $250 total. Almost enough for a month's worth of groceries. Or a partial rent payment to keep Doug at bay. When? How about right after lunch? I have my camera with me. Vern thought about his small, cold apartment, the nearly empty refrigerator, the photos on the wall that told the story of a life once full, now hollowed out. But $250 was $250. Sure, he said, right after lunch. As they finished their meals, Vern couldn't help but notice Darius watching him eat, seeing how he savored each bite, how he carefully wrapped the uneaten half of his toast in a napkin to take home. There was no judgment in the young reporter's eyes, only concern. And somehow, that was worse than judgment. 3 days later, Vern sat in his apartment staring at his phone. The screen showed a text message from Darius with a link to the article. Vern had been avoiding clicking on it all. Morning. The $250 was already safely tucked away in his wallet. $30 spent on groceries, the rest saved for the rent payment he would have to make in 2 days to avoid eviction. But at what cost? Letting a stranger into his apartment, letting him photograph the empty fridge, the stack of past due notices, the worn Bulls jacket he slept in because the heat barely worked. Finally, Vern tapped the link. The page loaded slowly on his old phone. The man who helped shape Jordan's shot now can't make ends meet. The headline felt like a punch to the gut. Below it was a photo of Vern sitting in his apartment, surrounded by basketball memorabilia, looking small and frail in his too big clothes. Vern forced himself to read the article. Darius had been fair, even respectful. He'd quoted Vern accurately about Jordan's work ethic and talent, but he'd also described, in painful detail, the conditions of Vern's life now. The empty kitchen, cabinets, the cold apartment, the unpaid medical bills on the counter. The final paragraph was the worst. Vernon Wilkins, once trusted by the Chicago Bulls to help develop the greatest player in basketball history, now rations saltine crackers and chooses between medication and heat. Meanwhile, Michael Jordan, whose shooting form Wilkins helped perfect, is worth an estimated $2.1 billion. Wilkins doesn't blame Jordan for his troubles and refuses to ask for help. I made my choices, he told me, but one has to wonder, does Jordan know his former coach is struggling to survive? Vern closed the article, his hand shaking. He'd never wanted anyone to know how bad things had gotten. Now it was out there for the world to see. His poverty, his failure, his shame. The phone buzzed with an incoming call. Tanya's name flashed on the screen. Vern's stomach sank. Of course she'd seen the article. He answered, bracing himself. "Dad?" Tanya's voice was tight with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me?" "It's not as bad as the article makes it sound," Vern lied. "Stop it. Just stop it, Dad." Her voice broke. "The reporter said your fridge is empty, that you're about to be evicted. How could you keep this from me?" "You have your own family to worry about," Vern said softly. "Your own bills. We would have figured something out. Jeff and I have 3 kids and a mortgage," Vern finished for her. "I won't be a burden, Tanya." There was silence on the line. Then, "I'm coming to get you. We'll make room. Lily can share with Emma." "No," Vern's voice was firm. "This is my home. I'm not leaving. Dad, please. I need to go, honey. Someone's at the door." Another lie. "I'll call you later." Vern hung up before she could argue more. He sat in silence for a long moment, feeling worse than before. Now Tanya was worried sick. And for what? Nothing had changed. He was still broke, still hungry, still alone. His phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. Coach Wilkins saw the article about you. Class of '05 here. Set up a GoFundMe for you. Already at $600 and climbing. We'll send you the link. Hang in there. Before Vern could process that, another text came in from a different number. Coach, it's Danny Rodriguez. Remember me? Point guard, 2003. Just read about your situation. This isn't right. We're organizing something for you. Many of us owe you so much. Then another. Coach Vern. Becky Miller here. Was Becky Thompson before I married. You may not remember me, but I was team manager, 95-98. Just donated to your GoFundMe. We're all sharing it. Help is coming. The texts kept coming. Former players, parents of players, colleagues from Riverdale High. All of them had seen the article. All of them wanted to help. Vern's eyes burned with tears of shame and gratitude. He didn't want charity, but the genuine concern in these messages touched something deep inside him. His phone buzzed yet again. This time, it was Mrs. Grayson from across the hall. Vernon, there's a reporter downstairs asking for you. Channel 5 News. What should I tell him? Vern stared at the message in horror. TV news? No, this was too much. He texted back, please tell him I'm not home. But it was too late. More texts came in reporting other news vans outside the building. The story was spreading. Going viral, as the kids would say. Vern turned off his phone and sat in his chair, overwhelmed. He had wanted to maintain his dignity, his privacy. Now his poverty was being broadcast to the world. He glanced at Jordan's number in his contacts. Would he have seen the article? Would he even care after all these years? A knock came at the door. Vern ignored it. Another knock, more insistent. Vern, it's Mrs. Grayson. I know you're in there. Please, open up. Reluctantly, Vern went to the door and opened it a crack. Mrs. Grayson stood there looking concerned. Are you all right? She asked. Those reporters are quite persistent. I'm fine, Vern said automatically. Mrs. Grayson didn't look convinced. Well, if you need anything, I'm right across the hall. And Vern? There's no shame in accepting help when you need it. But there was. At least for Vern Wilkins. There was. The next morning, Vern awoke to the sound of his phone ringing again. He'd turned it back on before going to bed, hoping the frenzy would have died down. The screen showed Tanya's name. He couldn't avoid her forever. Hello, sweetheart, he answered, trying to sound cheerful. Dad. Tanya's voice was raw, like she'd been crying. I've been trying to reach you all night. I'm sorry. My phone was off. The reporters... I know. I saw the news. It's everywhere, Dad. Everywhere. She took a shaky breath. I booked a flight. I'll be there tomorrow morning. Tanya, no. You can't. Don't you dare tell me I can't come see my own father, she cut in, her voice suddenly fierce. I'm coming, and that's final. Jeff will stay with the kids. What about your job? Vern asked weakly. I called in a family emergency. Because that's what this is, Dad. An emergency. Her voice softened. Why didn't you tell me how bad it was? All those times I asked how you were doing, and you said, fine. I didn't want you to worry. That's not your decision to make. Tanya's voice broke. I'm your daughter. We're supposed to take care of each other. Vern's eyes burned with unshed tears. I'm supposed to take care of you, not the other way around. That's not how family works, and you know it. She paused. Have you seen the GoFundMe? It's over $10,000 now. Vern's heart skipped a beat. What? Your former players started it. It's been shared thousands of times. People from all over the country are donating. There's even a hashtag trending. Help Coach Vern. Vern didn't know what to say. $10,000. It would solve his immediate problems: the rent, the bills, food for months. But the thought of taking charity from strangers made his stomach turn. "I can't accept that money," he said finally. "Dad, it's handouts, Tanya. I've worked my whole life. I've never taken charity." "It's not charity. It's people who care about you giving back." She paused. "And what about me? Will you at least let me help you? You have your own family to worry about." "You are my family." Her voice echoed through the phone. "Dad, please, stop being so stubborn." Before Vern could reply, there was a knock at his door. "Someone's here. I need to go. Promise you'll answer when I call back." "I promise. I love you, sweetheart." "I love you too, Dad." Vern hung up and moved slowly to the door. Through the peephole, he saw Mrs. Grayson holding a covered dish. He sighed and opened the door. "Good morning, Vernon," she said with a smile that didn't quite hide her concern. "I made breakfast casserole. Far too much for just me." It was the same excuse as before, but Vern didn't call her on it. "Thank you, Helen. Those reporters are still downstairs," she said, handing him the dish. "The building manager is trying to get them to leave, but they're stubborn types. I'm sorry for the trouble." "Nonsense. It's not your fault." She hesitated. "I saw that article and the news last night." Vern looked down at the casserole, unable to meet her eyes. "It's embarrassing." "No," she said firmly. "What's happening to you could happen to any of us. These pensions don't go far enough anymore." Vern nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "I'll leave you to your breakfast," Mrs. Grayson said. "But, Vernon, my door is always open if you need company, or anything else." After she left, Vern sat at his small table and ate the casserole. It was delicious. Eggs, cheese, potatoes, and sausage. A real meal. His body seemed to come alive with each bite, reminding him how long it had been since he'd eaten properly. His phone buzzed with a text. "Darius. Mr. Wilkins, I hope you're doing okay. The response to the article has been overwhelming. I'd like to do a follow-up piece. Maybe focus on the positive community response? Let me know if you're interested." Vern didn't reply. He wasn't ready to face more questions, more cameras, more pity. Another text came in, this one from an unknown number. "Coach, it's Marcus Lewis. I was on your Oro 2 championship team. I'm coaching at Riverdale now. The team wants to hold a fundraiser for you. These kids have heard all about you. You're a legend here. Please let us help. The current coach at Riverdale." Vern remembered hearing about Marcus taking the position a few years back. Good player, smart. He'd make a good coach. Vern's finger hovered over the reply button, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. What would he say? "Thanks, but no thanks. Thanks, but my pride won't let me accept help?" He finished the casserole and washed the dish carefully. He would return it to Mrs. Grayson later. It was the proper thing to do. His phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed unknown. Vern almost didn't answer, assuming it was another reporter. But something made him pick up. "Hello? Coach Vern?" The deep voice was instantly recognizable, even after all these years. Vern's heart seemed to stop. "Michael?" "Yeah, it's me." Michael Jordan's voice was exactly as Vern remembered it. "I just saw the article. Why didn't you call me, Coach? I gave you my number for a reason." Vern couldn't speak. Of all the reactions to the article, This was the one he'd both hoped for and dreaded the most. "Coach, you still there?" "I'm here," Vern managed. "We need to talk," Jordan said. "Face to face." Vern gripped the phone tighter. I don't know what to say, Michael." "You don't have to say anything right now. I'm in Paris for a business thing, but I'll be back in the States tomorrow. I can be in town the day after." "Where can we meet?" "The day after tomorrow. Eviction day." The thought hit Vern like a slap. "Coach, you still there?" "Yes," Vern said, his mind racing. "I'm not sure where would be good. There are reporters outside my building." "I'll figure something out," Jordan said. "Give me your address. I'll send a car." Vern hesitated, then gave Jordan his address. What did it matter now? The whole world seemed to know where he lived and how badly he was doing. "Hang tight, Coach. We'll get this sorted out." There was a pause. "And Vern? I'm sorry I didn't know sooner." "Not your fault," Vern said automatically. After the call ended, Vern sat in stunned silence. Michael Jordan had called him, was coming to see him. After all these years, but it was too late. Unless Vern could come up with 3 months back rent, by tomorrow he would be evicted before Jordan even arrived. The GoFundMe money wouldn't process in time. Tanya wouldn't arrive until tomorrow, and even if she had money to give him, could he bring himself to take it? Vern spent the rest of the day ignoring his ringing phone and the knocks at his door. He couldn't face any more reporters, any more neighbors, any more well-meaning people, whose concern felt like sandpaper on his raw pride. As evening fell, Vern began to pack. There wasn't much: his clothes, a few books, the precious photos and basketball memorabilia. He carefully wrapped the framed photo of him and Jordan in an old Bulls t-shirt, then placed it in a cardboard box that had once held a microwave. Chalanmind, his bedroom, Vern opened the small lockbox he kept in his nightstand. Inside was Marlene's wedding ring. He'd kept it after she died, unable to part with this last piece of her. The diamond was small, but the gold band still caught the light. A pawn shop would give him something for it, maybe enough to get a motel room for a few days. Vern's hand closed around the ring, feeling its familiar weight. The thought of selling it made him sick, but what choice did he have? He slipped the ring into his pocket and continued packing. Morning came too quickly. Vern had barely slept, his mind racing with worries. Where would he go? What would he do with his things? How would Jordan find him if he wasn't here? At exactly 9:20 a.m., there was a firm knock at the door. Vern knew who it was before he even looked through the peephole. Doug from Property Management, right on time, eviction notice in hand. Vern opened the door to find not only Doug, but also a sheriff's deputy. The law required an officer to be present for evictions. "Morning, Mr. Wilkins," Doug said, not meeting Vern's eyes. "I'm sorry about this, but you know why I'm here." "I know," Vern said. His voice sounded calm, detached, as if this was happening to someone else. "You have until noon to vacate the premises," the deputy said, handing Vern an official-looking document. "Any belongings left behind after that time will be removed by the property owner." Doug looked uncomfortable. "I saw the news, Mr. Wilkins. The article. If it were up to me—" "It's all right, Doug," Vern said. "You're just doing your job." "Do you have somewhere to go?" Doug asked. Vern nodded, though it was a lie. He had nowhere. The deputy and Doug exchanged glances, clearly not believing him. "There are shelters," the deputy began. "I'll be fine," Vern cut him off. After they left, Vern sat on one of his packed boxes, his cane between his knees. 3 hours to get out. 3 hours before he was officially homeless, his phone rang. Tanya, Dad? My flight lands in an hour. I'm coming straight from the airport. Don't come here, Vern said quickly. I won't be here. What? Why not? Vern couldn't bring himself to say the word evicted to his daughter. I'll call you when I'm settled. Don't worry. Dad, you're scaring me. Where are you going? I'll call you later, sweetheart. Vern hung up before she could ask more questions. The next call was from an unknown number. Vern almost didn't answer, but something told him he should. Hello? Coach Wilkins? This is Andrew Parker, Michael Jordan's personal assistant. Mr. Jordan asked me to check in with you. He's arranged for a car to pick you up tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Is that acceptable? I won't be at this address tomorrow, Vern said. There was a pause. May I ask where you'll be staying? We need to update the driver. I don't know yet, Vern admitted. Another pause. I see. Mr. Jordan mentioned you might be facing some housing difficulties. He's asked me to deliver something to you today. Would it be all right if I stopped by in about an hour? An hour. Vern would still be here. Yes, that's fine. After hanging up, Vern finished packing the last of his belongings. Everything he owned now fit into 4 cardboard boxes and a small suitcase. 78 years of life reduced to so little. He took Marlene's ring from his pocket and looked at it again. Could he really sell it? The thought made his chest ache. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was too early to be Jordan's assistant. Vern looked through the peephole to see Mrs. Grayson. Vernon, are you there? I saw that awful man from the office with a policeman. Are they evicting you? Vern opened the door. I have to be out by noon. Mrs. Grayson's face fell. Oh, Vernon, I'm so sorry. Where will you go? I'm not sure yet. You'll come stay with me, she said firmly. I have a spare bedroom. It's small, but it's yours for as long as you need it. Vern shook his head. I can't impose on you like that. It's not imposing if I'm offering. Mrs. Grayson crossed her arms. Vernon Wilkins, I won't take no for an answer. Frank would roll over in his grave if I let a good man like you go to a shelter or worse. Before Vern could respond, the building's front door buzzer sounded. Mrs. Grayson went to answer it through the intercom. Yes? I'm Andrew Parker, here, to see Vernon Wilkins. Mrs. Grayson buzzed him in, then turned back to Vern. Who's that? Michael Jordan's assistant, Vern said, the words sounding strange even to himself. A minute later, a tall, well-dressed man in his 30s appeared at the apartment door. Coach Wilkins, I'm Andrew Parker. Vern shook his hand. This is my neighbor, Helen Grayson. Andrew nodded politely to Mrs. Grayson, then turned back to Vern. Mr. Jordan asked me to give you this. He handed Vern an envelope. Vern's hand trembled, slightly as he took it. The envelope was heavy, expensive paper. His name was written on the front in a familiar scrawl. Jordan's handwriting, unchanged after all these years. Thank you, Vern said. Mr. Jordan is looking forward to seeing you tomorrow, Andrew said. I'll need a new address for the car service. Mrs. Grayson spoke up. He'll be staying with me, apartment 4A, right across the hall. Andrew nodded and made a note on his phone. 10 a.m. tomorrow, then. Good day, Coach Wilkins, Mrs. Grayson. After he left, Vern stared at the envelope in his hands. Well, Mrs. Grayson prompted, aren't you going to open it? Vern carefully tore open the envelope. Inside was a letter and a check. The check was for an amount that made Vern's eyes widen, more than enough to pay all his back rent and bills for months to come. The letter was simple. Coach, a small token of my gratitude. This isn't charity. It's long overdue payment for the lessons you taught me. MJ Vern stared at the check in his hands. The amount was more than he'd made in a year of coaching high school basketball. With this, he could pay his back rent, his medical bills, buy food for months. No more hunger, no more cold, but his hands trembled as he folded the check and placed it back in the envelope. "Vernon?" Mrs. Grayson asked, watching his face carefully. "What is it?" "It's too much," Vern said quietly. "I can't accept this." Mrs. Grayson's eyes widened. "Why ever not? If Mr. Jordan wants to help you—" "I didn't ask for this," Vern interrupted. "I didn't ask for any of this. The article, the GoFundMe, the reporters. All I wanted was to keep my dignity." "And what about keeping your home?" Mrs. Grayson asked gently. "Your health? Isn't there dignity in accepting help when you truly need it?" Before Vern could answer, there was another knock at the door. Doug from property management stood there, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Wilkins, I just got a call from the owner." He shuffled his feet. "Apparently someone's paid your back rent, all of it, plus 3 months in advance." Vern blinked in surprise. "What? Who?" "They wouldn't say, just that it's been handled, and the eviction is canceled." Doug handed Vern a receipt. "You're all paid up through July now." After Doug left, Vern sat heavily on his packed boxes. "I don't understand. I didn't deposit the check yet. How could Jordan have—" "It wasn't Mr. Jordan," Mrs. Grayson said, a small smile playing on her lips. "I saw the news this morning. Your former players, they pooled the GoFundMe money and paid your rent directly to the management company. They didn't want to wait for you to accept the help." Vern felt a lump in his throat. His players had done this? The kids he'd coached, now grown men and women with lives of their own, had come together to save their old coach from eviction? I don't know what to say," Vern whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Mrs. Grayson patted his shoulder. "Just start unpacking. You're staying right here where you belong." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Tanya arrived from the airport, rushing into Vern's apartment with tears in her eyes. She hugged him so tightly he could barely breathe. "Dad, why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "All those times I asked how you were doing." "I didn't want to worry you," Vern said. "That's not your job anymore," Tanya said firmly. "Your job is to let me help you, the same way you've always helped me." They spent the afternoon unpacking Vern's boxes. Tanya insisted on going grocery shopping, filling Vern's refrigerator and cupboards with more food than he'd seen in months. She paid his overdue electric bill and called the pharmacy to refill his heart medication. "I can pay you back," Vern said, watching her work. Jordan sent a check. Tanya stopped what she was doing. "Michael Jordan sent you money?" "Yes, and I'm going to give it back to him tomorrow when we meet." Tanya stared at her father. "You're what?" "Dad, that makes no sense. If he wants to help you—" "I don't need charity," Vern insisted. "It's not charity if it's earned," Tanya countered. "You helped him, didn't you? Early in his career? That's what the article said." "I did my job. I was paid for it then." Tanya shook her head in frustration. "Dad, please, this pride of yours, it nearly got you evicted. It had you starving yourself. For what?" Vern had no answer. That night, after Tanya had gone to Mrs. Grayson's spare room to sleep, she'd insisted on Vern keeping his own bed. Vern sat alone in his apartment. For the first time in months, his stomach was full. The heat was working properly. Tanya had called maintenance and insisted they fix it right away. His home was safe, at least for now. But still, something gnawed at him. A lifetime of independence reduced to this, depending on the charity of others. His daughter, his former players, and tomorrow. Michael Jordan. The thought of facing Jordan filled Vern with a mixture of emotions. Pride at what his former player had accomplished, shame at his own circumstances, gratitude for the check, even though he planned to return it, and underneath it all, a question. Why had Jordan lost touch for so many years, only to reappear now? The next morning, Vern woke early. He showered and shaved carefully, then put on his one good outfit, the same clothes he'd worn for the interview with Darius. Tanya had insisted on ironing them, so they looked better than before. At exactly 10:00 a.m., Vern's phone rang. The car was waiting downstairs. "Do you want me to come with you?" Tanya asked, as Vern prepared to leave. "No, sweetheart. This is something I need to do alone." The car was a sleek black SUV with tinted windows. The driver, a professional-looking woman in a suit, opened the door for Vern. "Good morning, Mr. Wilkins. I'm taking you to meet Mr. Jordan." Vern settled into the plush leather seat, Jordan's envelope secure in his jacket pocket. The driver didn't say where they were going, and Vern didn't ask. 30 minutes later, they pulled up to a private airfield outside the city. A small jet with the Jumpman logo on the tail sat on the tarmac. "Mr. Jordan is waiting for you aboard the aircraft," the driver said, helping Vern out of the SUV. Vern took a deep breath and made his way up the stairs to the jet, his cane thumping on each step. At the top, the door was open, revealing the luxurious interior, and there, sitting in a leather chair, was Michael Jordan. He looked older, of course. It had been over 20 years, but still unmistakably the man Vern had coached all those years. Ego. He stood as Vern entered, towering over him just as he always had. "Coach," Jordan said, his voice warm. "It's been too long." "Michael," Vern replied, suddenly feeling every one of his 78 years. "You didn't have to do all this." "Yes, I did," Jordan gestured to a seat across from his. "We have a lot to catch up on." As Vern sat down, he pulled the envelope from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. "I can't accept this," he said. Jordan looked at the envelope, then back at Vern. His expression was unreadable. "We'll talk about that," he said. "But first, I want to know everything that's happened since we last spoke. The real story, Coach, not what was in that article." And so, as the private jet sat on the tarmac, Vern found himself telling Michael Jordan the unvarnished truth about his life, the good years at Riverdale High, Marlene's illness and death, the stroke, the slow slide into poverty. Throughout it all, Jordan listened intently, never interrupting, his famous intensity focused entirely on his former coach. When Vern finally finished speaking, Jordan leaned forward in his seat. "Now," he said quietly, "let me tell you why I'm really here." Jordan leaned back in his seat, his eyes never leaving Vern's face. "I've been looking for you for years." Vern blinked in surprise. "Looking for me? But I've been in the same town, the same school for decades." "I know that now," Jordan said, shaking his head. "But every time I tried to find you, something went wrong. The Bulls had an old address for you. The school district wouldn't give out personal information. Your number changed. After Marlene died," Vern said softly, "I had to cut expenses." Jordan nodded. "I even hired a private investigator about 5 years ago. He found a Vernon Wilkins, but it was the wrong one, some lawyer in Seattle." He sighed. "Then, yesterday, I get a call from Scotty. 'Have you seen this article?' he asks me. And there you were." Vern felt a strange mixture of emotions. Jordan had been looking for him all this time? But why? Vern asked. "Why look for me?" "Because I owe you," Jordan said simply. "More than you know." Vern shook his head. You don't owe me anything, Michael. I was just doing my job. No, Jordan's voice was firm. It was more than that. You remember that summer, 1984? After my rookie season? Vern nodded. How could he forget? Jordan, young and hungry to improve, had stayed in Chicago while his teammates scattered for vacation. I was struggling, Jordan continued. My shot was inconsistent. I was frustrated, ready to give up some days. You were young, Vern said. All players go through that. But not all players have someone like you. Jordan leaned forward again. You stayed with me, hours after practice, day after day, working on my form. Elbow, in, follow through, trust the arc. I still hear your voice saying that. Vern smiled slightly. You needed the repetition. I needed the belief, Jordan corrected. You saw something in me when I was just another rookie. You told me I could be great if I did the work. And I believed you. A flight attendant appeared with drinks, water for Vern, something stronger for Jordan. After she left, Jordan continued. That form you helped me perfect? It became my foundation. Through every championship, every MVP season, every game-winning shot, the mechanics you taught me were there. Vern felt his throat tighten. You had the talent, Michael. The drive. I just helped with the details. The details matter. Jordan took a sip of his drink. That check you're trying to give back? It's nothing compared to what your guidance did for my career, for my life. He pushed the envelope back toward Vern. Take it. Use it. Consider it. Delayed payment for private coaching. Vern stared at the envelope. Put that way, it wasn't charity. It was compensation. But still, there's something else, Jordan said, interrupting Vern's thoughts. Something bigger. The real reason I wanted to find you. From a briefcase beside his seat, Jordan pulled out a folder. He opened it and slid a document across to Vern. The Vernon Wilkins Basketball Academy, Vern read from the top of the paper. What is this? Your next chapter, Jordan said, a hint of his famous smile appearing. I'm funding a training center for underprivileged kids in your city. State-of-the-art facilities. Programs for kids who can't afford private coaching. And I want you to run it. Vern stared at the papers, unable to process what he was hearing. Michael, I'm almost 80. I had a stroke. I can barely demonstrate a proper shooting form anymore. You don't need to run up and down the court, Jordan said. You need to do what you do best. Teach, share your knowledge, build a staff of young coaches who can learn from you. The papers detailed a salary that made Vern's eyes widen. Benefits, a housing allowance. Jordan had thought of everything. This isn't charity either, Jordan said, as if reading Vern's mind. This is business. I'm investing in youth basketball, and I need the best to run it. That's you. Vern shook his head. There are younger coaches, better coaches. No, Jordan said firmly. There's no one better for this. Those kids you coached at Riverdale, they're not just raising money for you. They're posting online about how you changed their lives, how you taught them about more than basketball. That's the person I want leading this academy. Vern's hands trembled as he flipped through the documents. Floor plans for the facility, budgets, programs for kids from elementary through high school. It was a basketball coach's dream. I don't know what to say, Vern admitted. Say yes, Jordan replied. Say you'll stop being so damn stubborn and accept that sometimes the people you helped want to help you back. A small laugh escaped Vern. You always were direct. I learned that from you too. Jordan smiled. Remember what you told me when I was overthinking my shot? Stop thinking. Start shooting. best advice I ever got." Vern remembered that day clearly. Jordan, frustrated after missing several jumpers in a row, had begun second-guessing every aspect of his form. Vern had finally told him to get out of his own head and trust his training. "The academy breaks ground next month," Jordan continued. "We can have it up and running by fall. In the meantime, there's an apartment near the site, part of the deal. And this," Jordan reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. He placed it next to the folder. "What's this?" Vern asked. "Your temporary office at the community center on Elm Street. I've rented the space for you to start developing the program. Curriculum, coaching staff, whatever you need. You start Monday." Vern stared at the key. "You're giving me no time to think about this." "Because you'll overthink it," Jordan said. "Like I used to overthink my shot. Sometimes you need to just trust and take the leap." There was a long silence as Vern considered everything Jordan had said. A chance to coach again, to make a difference in kids' lives, to have purpose again, at a time when he'd thought that part of his life was over. But more than that, a chance to reclaim his dignity. This wasn't charity, this was work, real work that he was uniquely qualified to do. "What about Tanya?" Vern asked finally. "She came all this way to help me." "Bring her to see the site," Jordan said. "Let her know you're okay, that you've got a new chapter starting." Vern nodded slowly. Then, with a steady hand that surprised even himself, he picked up the key. "Monday," he said. Jordan's smile widened. "That's what I wanted to hear, Coach." As they shook hands, Vern felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real, tangible, hope for his future. "There's one more thing," Jordan said, reaching again into his briefcase. "Something I've carried with me for a long time." He pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age, the corners worn as if it had been handled many times. He handed it to Vern. "Do you remember this?" Vern opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter, written in his own handwriting, dated July 12, 1984. He'd written it to Jordan after a particularly difficult practice, when the young player had been ready to give up on changing his shooting form. "You kept this?" Vern asked, astonished. "All these years?" Jordan nodded. "Read it again." Vern's eyes moved over his own words from nearly 40 years ago. "Michael, greatness isn't about perfect days. It's about showing up on the imperfect ones. Your shot will come. Trust the process. Trust the work. Most importantly, trust yourself. You have something special inside you. Something I've seen in only a handful of players in all my years of coaching. Don't let temporary struggles blind you to your permanent potential." Coach Vern. "I read that letter before every playoff game," Jordan said quietly. "Even the last one. It reminded me of what mattered. The process, the work, trusting myself when doubts crept in." Vern handed the letter back, but Jordan shook his head. "Keep it. Put it up in your new office. Let it remind you of your own words. Don't let temporary struggles blind you to your permanent potential. Your story isn't over, Coach. It's just taking a new turn." Vern carefully placed the letter in his pocket, next to his heart. For the first time in a very long time, he felt something like peace. The car ride back to his apartment was quiet. Vern's mind raced with plans for the academy. Coaching philosophies, training programs, drills he'd developed over decades. Ideas he thought he'd never use again were suddenly relevant, important. When the SUV pulled up to his building, Vern was surprised to see the news vans were gone. His story was already old news, replaced by whatever fresh crisis or celebrity scandal had captured the public's attention. He was grateful for the anonymity. Tanya was waiting anxiously in his apartment. "Dad, how did it go? What did Jordan want?" The questions tumbled out as soon as he walked through the door. Vern smiled. "He offered me a job." Tanya's eyes widened as Vern explained about the basketball academy, the salary, the apartment. With each detail, her expression shifted from concern to disbelief to joy. "Dad, that's incredible! So you're going to take it, right?" She studied his face. "Please tell me you didn't turn it down because of pride." "I took it," Vern confirmed. "I start Monday." Tanya flung her arms around him, nearly knocking him off balance. "I'm so proud of you." "For taking charity?" Vern couldn't help asking. Tanya pulled back to look at him. "It's not charity if you're earning it. And you will earn it, Dad. Those kids will be lucky to have you." After lunch, Vern felt restless. He wanted to see the community center where he'd be working temporarily. Tanya offered to drive him, but Vern insisted on going alone. "I need to get used to being independent again," he said. "Besides, you've done enough already." The community center was a 15-minute bus ride away. As Vern climbed the steps to the entrance, he noticed the sign, Riverside Community Center. Below it, a smaller sign read, Home of the South Side Youth Basketball League. Inside, the building smelled of floor wax and sweat, the familiar scent of gymnasiums everywhere. Vern followed the sound of bouncing basketballs to a set of double doors. Pushing them open, he found himself at the edge of a basketball court, where about a dozen kids, ranging from maybe 10 to 15 years old, were practicing. A young man, probably in his early 30s, was coaching them. "Tommy, watch your footwork. Zoe, good shot, but remember to follow through." Vern stood quietly, watching. The coach had good instincts, but some of his technical advice needed refinement. One boy in particular caught Vern's attention. Tall for his age, maybe 13, with natural athleticism but a flawed shooting motion. His elbow splayed out just like Jordan's had all those years ago. Vern found himself moving closer to the court, leaning on his cane, studying the boy's form. The coach noticed him and approached. "Can I help you, sir?" "I'm Vernon Wilkins," Vernie said, extending his hand. "I'll be using the office space here starting Monday." Recognition dawned on the younger man's face. "Coach Wilkins, from Riverdale High. I'm Marcus Green. I played against your teams when I was at Westside. You probably don't remember me." "Point guard," Vern said, the memory clicking into place. "Quick hands, decent shooter." Marcus's face lit up. "You do remember. Man, your teams were tough to beat." He glanced back at the kids, who had continued practicing. "I'm just a volunteer coach here, trying to keep these kids off the streets, you know?" Vern nodded. "That boy there," he said, pointing to the tall kid he'd noticed. "What's his name?" "Deshaun," Marcus replied. "Tons of raw talent, but I can't get his shot consistent. His elbows drifting," Vern said. "Mind if I offer some advice?" "Are you kidding?" "That would be amazing." Marcus called Deshaun over. The boy approached warily, eyeing the old man with the cane. "Deshaun, this is Coach Wilkins. He used to coach Michael Jordan. He has some tips for your jump shot." Deshaun's wariness turned to wide-eyed interest. "For real? You coached Jordan?" "I worked with him on his shooting form," Vern said modestly. "And you have the same issue he did at your age." "What's that?" Deshaun asked. "Your elbow. It's drifting out instead of staying in line with the basket." Vern demonstrated with his own arm, ignoring the twinge in his shoulder. "Try this. Imagine there's a wall right beside you. Your elbow should never touch that wall during your shot." Deshaun nodded, took the ball, and tried a shot with Vern's advice in mind. It went in cleanly. "Whoa," Deshaun said, looking at Vern with new respect. "Again," Vern instructed, "and this time, focus on your follow-through too. Hold it until the ball hits the rim." Deshaun took another shot. Swish. "That's it," Vern said, a familiar warmth spreading through him. The feeling of teaching, of making a difference. "Now, do it 100 more times until it's muscle memory." Before long, other kids had gathered around, curious about the old man giving Deshaun advice. Marcus explained who Vern was, and suddenly, Vern found himself surrounded by young players eager for coaching. For the next hour, Vern lost himself in the joy of teaching. His fatigue, his worries, even his awareness of his age and limitations faded away as he focused on correct hand placement, proper footwork, the mechanics of a perfect shot. When the practice ended, Marcus approached Vern again. "Coach, that was incredible. These kids just had the best practice of their lives. Would you consider, if you're going to be working here anyway, could you help out with the team sometimes?" Vern looked at the hopeful faces of the kids, still buzzing with excitement from the improvements they'd made in just one session. "I'd be honored," he said. As Vern prepared to leave, Deshaun ran up to him. "Coach Wilkins, thanks for the help. My shot feels different now. Better." "Keep practicing," Vern told him. "Repetition creates muscle memory." "Will you be here tomorrow?" Deshaun asked. "I'll be here Monday," Vern said, "and many days after that." Walking to the bus stop, Vern realized he'd left his apartment that morning feeling uncertain about his future. Now, he couldn't wait for Monday to arrive. The academy planning could wait a few days. Right now, there were kids who needed coaching. Kids like Deshaun with raw talent waiting to be shaped. For the first time since his stroke, Vern felt truly useful again. Needed. The weight of hunger and financial worry had been lifted, replaced by the comfortable weight of purpose. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice the news van parked across from his building until it was too late. A reporter with a microphone headed straight for him. "Coach Wilkins, Raquel Martinez, Channel 5 News. Can we get a statement about Michael Jordan's visit today?" Vern froze as the reporter thrust a microphone toward his face. Behind her, a cameraman aimed his lens directly at him. Vern instinctively raised a hand to block his face. "No comment," he said, trying to move past them to his building's entrance. "Sources say Jordan offered you a job," the reporter persisted, following him. "Is that true? Will you be working with him?" "Please, I just want to go home," Vern said, his good mood evaporating. How had they found out about the job offer so quickly? "Coach, people are inspired by your story," Raquel continued. "A former NBA coach who helped shape Jordan's career, now getting a second chance. Our viewers would love to hear from you." Vern stopped at the building's door. "I wasn't an NBA coach. I was an assistant, and my story isn't for public consumption." Yadri, he fumbled with his keys. The reporter pressed on. "What about the GoFundMe set up by your former players? Over $15,000 raised. How does that make you feel?" The amount stunned Vern. $15,000? From his former players? He didn't know whether to feel touched or mortified. Before he could decide how to respond, the building door opened from the inside. Marcus stood there, his expression hardening when he saw the news crew. "Coach Wilkins is done with interviews," he said firmly. "Please respect his privacy." Marcus pulled Vern inside and shut the door on the protesting reporter. The lobby was blessedly quiet after the commotion outside. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" Vern asked, surprised to see the young coach. "I followed you home," Marcus admitted. Wanted to make sure you got back okay. Good thing I did. Thank you, Vern said sincerely. Those reporters, they don't understand. Actually, I do understand, a voice called from the stairwell. Darius Jackson, the reporter who'd started it all, descended the last few steps into the lobby. That's why I came to apologize. Vern stared at him. You? What are you apologizing for? Your article is why I have reporters hounding me. And why? You have $15,000 in donations and a job offer from Michael Jordan. Darius countered gently. But I should have prepared you better for what would happen when the story went viral. Marcus looked between them, confused. Wait, you're the reporter who wrote the article? Man, you started something big. Darius nodded. I didn't expect it to blow up like this. I just wanted to tell Coach Wilkins' story. Well, mission accomplished, Vern said, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. Now, my private struggles are entertainment for the masses. Coach, I'm sorry if it feels that way, Darius said. But your story has inspired people, not just to donate money, but to think about how we treat our elderly, how we let people who've contributed so much just fall through the cracks. Vern felt his anger deflate slightly. The young reporter seemed genuinely remorseful. I came to offer you a follow-up piece, Darius continued. On your terms this time, a chance to tell your story the way you want it. Told. No ambushes, no invasions of privacy. I appreciate the offer, Vern said, but I've had enough publicity to last a lifetime. Fair enough, Darius replied, but the news crews will keep coming unless they get something. Human interest stories like yours don't just disappear. Marcus spoke up. He's right, Coach. My sister works in PR. If you don't control the narrative, someone else will. Vern sighed heavily. They had a point. Already the reporter outside had twisted the facts, calling him an NBA coach when he'd only been an assistant. What would this follow-up involve? He asked Darius reluctantly. One interview. You choose the location, the time. I write it up. You approve it before publication. After that, I promise to advocate for your privacy with other media outlets. And what about the kids at the community center? Vern asked. I want to help them without cameras in their faces. I'll make that clear in the article, Darius promised, that your work with the local youth program is off-limits to the press. Vern considered the offer. It wasn't ideal, but it might be the best way to regain control of his life and privacy. Tomorrow, he decided. The community center, 9 a.m., before the kids arrive for practice. I'll be there, Darius said, relief evident in his voice. Thank you, Coach? After Darius left, Marcus helped Vern upstairs to his apartment. Tanya was waiting, worried after seeing the news van outside. Dad, are you okay? I saw that reporter. I'm fine, Vern assured her. Marcus here helped me avoid the worst of it. He introduced the young coach to his daughter. I should get going, Marcus said after exchanging pleasantries. But I'll see you Monday, Coach. The kids are already talking about your next visit. After Marcus left, Vern told Tanya about his agreement to do one final interview with Darius. Are you sure about this, Dad? She asked. You don't owe them anything. I'm not doing it for them, Vern said. I'm doing it for those kids at the center, and for myself. If I'm going to have a public story, I want it to be accurate. That evening, as Vern prepared for bed, his phone rang. The screen showed unknown caller. Assuming it was another reporter, Vern almost didn't answer. But something made him pick up. Hello? Coach Wilkins? It's Andrew Parker again, Michael Jordan's assistant. Mr. Jordan asked me to check in with you. I'm fine, Vern said automatically. He also wanted me to let you know that he's scheduled a press conference for Monday morning. He'll be announcing the Vernon Wilkins Basketball Academy officially. Vern's heart sank. A press conference meant more attention, more reporters. "Is that really necessary?" he asked. "Mr. Jordan thinks so," Andrew replied. "He believes the Academy deserves public support and recognition. He'd like you to be there, but he understands if you're not comfortable with that." Vern thought about the kids at the center, about Deshaun and his improving jump shot, about the opportunity to help more young players like him through the Academy. "Tell Michael I'll be there," Vern said finally. "But afterward, I want to focus on the work, not the publicity." "Understood. The car will pick you up at 8 a.m. Monday." Andrew paused. "One more thing, Coach. Mr. Jordan mentioned you might be uncomfortable with the attention. He said to remind you of something you once told him. Sometimes you have to be uncomfortable to grow." Vern couldn't help but smile. His own words coming back to him after all these years. That night, as Vern lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling, thinking about how much his life had changed in just a few days. From the brink of eviction to the cusp of a new career. From anonymity to unwanted fame. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Vern opened it to find a message from Deshaun, the boy from the center. "Coach Marcus gave me your number. Just wanted to say thanks again for the help. Been practicing, like you said. Can't wait for Monday. You really coached Jordan for real?" And just like that, Vern remembered why all this mattered. The weekend passed in a blur. The interview with Darius went better than expected. True to his word, the young reporter let Vern tell his story his way. No intrusive questions, no attempts to make him look pitiful. Just an honest conversation about his career, his challenges, and his new opportunity with the Vernon Wilkins Basketball Academy. By Sunday evening, Tanya had to return to California. Her husband and children needed her. "Are you sure you'll be okay?" she asked as they stood in the airport terminal. "I can come back for the press conference tomorrow." "I'll be fine," Vern assured her. "You've done more than enough already." He hugged her tightly. "And I promise, no more secrets. If I need help, I'll ask." "That's all I wanted to hear," Tanya said, wiping away a tear. "I'm so proud of you, Dad. This academy, it's perfect for you." After she left, Vern returned to his apartment, which felt emptier without her, but not as empty as before. Now it was filled with groceries, with heat, with a future. Vern laid out his suit for the morning, the same one he'd worn to meet Jordan, freshly cleaned and pressed. He polished his dress shoes until they shone. If he was going to be on a stage with Michael Jordan, he wanted to look the part. He tried to sleep, but excitement and nervousness kept him awake. At 5 in the morning, he gave up and got out of bed. He showered and shaved with extra care, then made himself a breakfast of eggs and toast, a luxury that still felt new after months of rationing food. At exactly 8 a.m., his phone rang. The beep car was waiting. This time, the SUV took him to a downtown hotel. Andrew Parker met him in the lobby, elegant and efficient as always. "Good morning, Coach Wilkins. Mr. Jordan is upstairs with the PR team. The press conference is at 10 in the main ballroom. We'd like to go over a few talking points with you first, if that's all right." Vern nodded, following Andrew to an elevator that required a keycard to access. They rode up to the top floor in silence. The suite was bustling with activity. People on phones, laptops open, papers being passed around. And in the center of it all, Michael Jordan, looking perfectly at ease in an impeccable suit. "Coach," Jordan greeted him warmly. "Ready for the big announcement?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Vern replied honestly. Jordan grinned. "Don't worry, I'll do most of the talking. You just have to stand there and look like the basketball genius. You are?" A young woman approached with a tablet. "Mr. Wilkins, we've prepared some remarks for you. Just a few words about your vision for the Academy. Would you like to review them? Vern took the tablet and scanned the prepared statement. It was well written but generic, thanking Jordan for the opportunity, expressing excitement about working with young athletes. "I appreciate this," Vern said, handing the tablet back, "but I'd rather speak from the heart." The PR woman looked uncertain. "Are you sure? These events can be nerve-wracking." "Let him say what he wants," Jordan interrupted. "Coach knows how to talk basketball better than any of us." The next hour was a whirlwind of preparations. A makeup artist dabbed powder on Vern's face to reduce shine under the lights. Someone clipped a microphone to his lapel. Jordan and Vern reviewed the basic flow of the press conference, but not the content of what would be said. At 9:55, they were led to a holding area just off the ballroom. Through the door, Vern could hear the murmur of gathered press. His heart pounded in his chest. What had he gotten himself into? "Nervous?" Jordan asked, noticing Vern's expression. "Terrified," Vern admitted. "I'm a coach, not a public speaker." Jordan put a hand on his shoulder. "Just pretend they're all rookies who need to work on their jump shots." Vern laughed despite himself, and some of the tension eased from his body. The door opened. Andrew nodded. To them. "They're ready." The ballroom was packed with reporters, cameras, and recording devices. A stage had been set up at the front, with a podium bearing the Jumpman logo. Jordan led the way, Vern following a step behind. The cameras clicked and flashed as they took their positions. Jordan at the podium, Vern slightly to his right. A large screen behind them displayed a rendering of a state-of-the-art basketball facility with Vernon Wilkins Basketball Academy across the top. Jordan began speaking, his deep voice commanding the room's attention. He talked about the importance of youth basketball programs, about giving back to communities, about creating opportunities for kids who couldn't afford private coaching. "And that's why I'm proud to announce the Vernon Wilkins Basketball Academy," Jordan said, gesturing to the screen behind them. "Named for a man who helped shape not just my shooting form, but my understanding of what it means to work hard, to perfect your craft, to believe in yourself." Vern stood straighter, overwhelmed by Jordan's words. This was really happening. "Coach Wilkins will serve as the Academy's executive director," Jordan continued. "His decades of experience, his basketball knowledge, and most importantly, his ability to connect with young players make him the perfect person to lead this initiative." Jordan turned to Vern. "Coach, would you like to say a few words?" As Vern stepped to the podium, he saw a familiar face in the crowd. Darius, the reporter, whose article had started all this, sat in the front row, smiling encouragingly. Vern cleared his throat. "Thank you, Michael. When I started coaching, I never imagined standing here today." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Basketball has given me everything. A career, friendships, purpose. Even in my darkest moments recently, it was basketball that saved me." The room was completely silent now, every ear tuned to his words. "This academy isn't about creating NBA stars, though I won't complain if we do." That got a small laugh from the crowd. "It's about teaching young people that discipline, hard work, and believing in yourself matter, on and off the court." Vern looked directly at Jordan. "Michael talks about what I taught him. But the truth is, I've learned more from my players than they ever learned from me. I've learned about perseverance, about getting back up when you fall, about never giving up on your dreams." He turned back to the audience. "That's what the Vernon Wilkins Basketball Academy will teach. Not just better jump shots, but better people." As Vern stepped back from the podium, the room erupted in applause. Jordan shook his hand. a look of genuine respect in his eyes. "Perfect," Jordan whispered. "Couldn't have said it better myself." Phew. Press conference continued with questions from reporters. Most were directed at Jordan, but a few came Vern's way. He answered honestly, speaking about his vision for the academy, his excitement about working with youth again. Finally, Andrew announced, "Last question." A reporter in the back stood up. "Coach Wilkins, can you tell us what it felt like to go from nearly being evicted to having an academy named after you?" That's quite a turnaround. Vern took a deep breath, considering his answer carefully. "It feels like making a game-winning shot," he said finally. "Unexpected, thrilling, and humbling, because you know you didn't do it alone." The answer seemed to satisfy the reporter, and with that, the press conference was over. Jordan and Vern were whisked backstage as reporters called out follow-up questions that went unanswered. "You did great, Coach," Jordan said once they were away from the cameras. "How are you feeling?" "Like I need to sit down," Vern admitted. The adrenaline that had carried him through was fading, leaving him shaky and tired. Jordan guided him to a chair. "Take a minute. Then there's something I want to show you." Vern closed his eyes, letting his heartbeat return to normal. When he opened them, Jordan was on the phone, speaking quietly. He caught Vern's eye and held up one finger. "Just a minute more." Andrew approached with a bottle of water, which Vern accepted gratefully. "You were excellent out there, Mr. Wilkins. Very authentic." "Thanks," Vern said. "I'm not used to all this attention." "You'll get more used to it," Andrew said. "The academy will attract publicity, especially with Mr. Jordan's involvement. But we'll help manage it." Jordan finished his call and rejoined them. "Ready for one more stop today, Coach?" "Where? 2?" Vern asked. "The site," Jordan said with a grin. "It's time you saw where your academy will be built." The SUV took them to the outskirts of the city, where new development was pushing into once vacant land. They turned down a road Vern didn't recognize and stopped at a chain-link fence surrounding an empty field. A construction trailer sat near the entrance. As they got out of the car, Vern saw a group of people waiting by the trailer. As he got closer, he realized they were familiar faces, former players from his high school teams, some now middle-aged with children of their own. "Surprise," Jordan said quietly. "They wanted to be here." Tommy Reese stepped forward. "Coach Wilkins, we're so happy for you." He gestured to the group. "We all are." Vern was overwhelmed. There were at least 30 of his former players there, spanning his entire career at Riverdale High. Some he hadn't seen in decades. "How did you all know about this?" Vern asked, shaking hands and accepting hugs. "Mr. Jordan's people contacted the Booster Club," explained Marcus Lewis, the current Riverdale coach. "We spread the word to as many former players as we could find. You're looking at the first group of volunteer assistant coaches for your academy," Jordan added. "If you'll have them." Vern felt a lump in his throat. These were men and women who had careers, families, responsibilities. Yet they were here, offering their time and energy to help him build something new. "I'd be honored," Vern said, his voice thick with emotion. Jordan led the group to the construction trailer, which had been set up as a makeshift presentation room. Inside, detailed plans for the academy were displayed on boards around the walls. "We break ground next week," Jordan explained, pointing to the timeline. "The main building should be completed in 6 months, with the outdoor courts finished sooner." The plans were more elaborate than Vern had imagined. Multiple indoor courts, locker rooms, classrooms for video study, a strength and conditioning center, offices for staff, even housing for camp participants from out of town. "This is incredible," Vern said, studying the drawings. More than I ever dreamed of. "It's only the beginning," Jordan said. "I want this to be the best youth basketball facility in the country. A model others will follow." One of Vern's former players, now a successful architect, had helped design the facility. He walked Vern through the features, explaining how the space could accommodate different age groups and skill levels simultaneously. As they talked, Vern noticed Jordan slip outside with Andrew. A few minutes later, they returned, Jordan looking unusually serious. "Coach, can I speak with you privately?" he asked. Concerned, Vern followed Jordan to a small office at the back of the trailer. "Is everything all right?" Vern asked once the door was closed. "That depends," Jordan said. "I just got a call from my foundation's legal team. There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have mentioned earlier." Vern's stomach tightened with anxiety. Was there a problem with the academy? A legal issue he didn't know about? "The Jumpman logo," Jordan said, pulling out his phone and showing the famous silhouette. "The one that's earned billions for Nike and for me." "What about it?" Vern asked, confused by this change in topic. "It's based on a photograph taken in 1984, Jordan continued. "Me, doing a slam dunk, legs and arms extended. It became the most recognizable sports logo in history." Vern nodded, still not understanding the relevance. "But what most people don't know," Jordan said, his voice softer now, "is that photo was taken during a drill you created. The elevation drill, you called it, where you had me practice jumping as high as possible, holding the ball at full extension." Vern remembered the drill clearly. It was designed to help Jordan maximize his vertical leap while maintaining ball control. "The form captured in that photo, the form that became the logo, was directly influenced by your coaching," Jordan said. "And I never gave you credit for that, never shared the proceeds." "That wasn't right," Vern shook his head. "Michael, that's ridiculous. You don't owe me anything for a drill I taught you. That's what coaches do." "Maybe," Jordan said, "but my legal team disagrees. They've reviewed everything and believe you have a legitimate claim to a percentage of the Jumpman proceeds." Vern couldn't believe what he was hearing. "I don't want money from your logo, Michael." "I know you don't," Jordan said with a small smile. "But here's the thing. The academy needs long-term funding, beyond what I'm putting in initially." "What if the proceeds went there instead? A permanent endowment to ensure the Vernon Wilkins Basketball Academy continues for generations?" Vern sat back, stunned. An endowment would mean the academy would never face the kind of financial struggles he had. It would be secure, forever. Vern struggled to find words. That would be an incredible legacy. "Then it's settled," Jordan said, extending his hand. 1% of all Jumpman revenue from now on goes to the Academy's endowment. My lawyers are drawing up the paperwork as we speak. 1% might not sound like much, Vern thought, but of a brand worth billions, it represented security for the Academy far into the future. As they shook hands, Vern felt a wave of emotion wash over him. From the brink of eviction to this moment. It seemed impossible. Yet here he was. "Thank you, Michael," he said softly. "For everything." "No, Coach," Jordan replied, his normally confident voice tinged with rare emotion. "Thank you. This isn't charity. This isn't even kindness. This is the greatest assist of my career. Passing the ball back to the man who helped make me who I am." The moment was interrupted by a sharp pain in Vern's chest. It started as a pinch, then quickly spread across his upper body like a vice tightening. He tried to take a breath, but it felt like someone was sitting on his chest. "Coach!" Jordan's voice sounded distant. "You okay?" Vern clutched at his chest, his vision blurring. He reached for Jordan's arm to steady himself, but his knees buckled. As he collapsed, he heard Jordan shouting for help, felt strong arms catching him before he hit the floor. Then, darkness. Beeping. That was the first thing Vern became aware of. A steady, rhythmic beeping. Then, the antiseptic smell. Hospital. He was in a hospital. Vern opened his eyes slowly. The room was dim, but he could make out machines beside his bed, tubes running to his arm, a clip on his finger measuring his pulse. "He's awake!" It was Tanya's voice. She leaned into his field of vision, her face etched with worry. "Dad, can you hear me?" "I hear you," Vern said, his voice a dry rasp. "What happened?" "You had a heart attack," said another voice. Vern turned his head to see Michael Jordan sitting on the other side of the bed. "Scared the hell out of all of us." "How long?" Vern began. 2 days, Tanya supplied. "I flew back as soon as they called me." Vern tried to sit up, but Tanya gently pushed him back. "Easy, Dad. The doctor said you need to rest." "The academy," Vern said. "Is fine," Jordan assured him. "Everything's proceeding as planned. Your only job right now is to get better." A doctor arrived, checking Vern's vitals and explaining what had happened. The heart attack was relatively minor, caused by stress and years of poor nutrition. With proper medication, diet, and rest, Vern would recover. "You're lucky, Mr. Wilkins," the doctor said. "If this had happened a week ago, when you were alone, in your apartment," he didn't need to finish the thought. "If the heart attack had come before the article, before Jordan, before everything changed, Vern might not have survived." "When can I start work?" Vern asked. The doctor and Tanya exchanged looks. "You need to focus on recovery first," the doctor said firmly. "At least a month of rest before you even think about working." Vern wanted to argue, but the exhaustion pulling at him was stronger than his will. He nodded and closed his eyes. When he woke again, the room was brighter. Tanya was gone, but Jordan remained, working on a laptop in the corner. "Still here?" Vern asked. Jordan looked up. "Someone had to make sure you followed doctor's orders." He closed the laptop and moved back to the chair beside Vern's bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been fouled by Charles Barkley," Vern said with a weak smile. "But I'll live." "Good." Jordan placed something on the bed beside Vern's hand. "Because this came for you." It was a handmade Get Well card. The front showed a basketball hoop with "Get Well Coach Vern" written in uneven letters. Inside were signatures from the kids at the community center, including Deshaun's distinctive scrawl. "They've been asking about you," Jordan said. "Especially that tall kid with the jump shot." "What's his name?" "Deshaun," Vern said, running his fingers over the card. "He reminds me of you at that age. Raw talent that just needs direction." Jordan nodded. "I saw him playing." "You're right. He's got something special." He paused. "Which is why I've been thinking about a slight change to our plans." "What kind of change?" Vern asked. "The academy will take time to build. But those kids need coaching now?" Jordan leaned forward in his chair. "What if we start smaller? Use the community center as a temporary home base? You could begin working with Deshaun and the others, developing the curriculum, building the program, all at a pace that won't put you back in this hospital." It was a perfect solution. Vern would have purpose, the kids would get coaching, and he could ease into his new role while recovering. "I'd like that," Vern said. "Good," Jordan replied, "because I already set it up. 3 days a week, 2 hours per session. Enough to make a difference without wearing you out." Later that afternoon, the doctor returned with release papers. "You can go home tomorrow, Mr. Wilkins. But remember, rest, proper meals, and take your medication. I'll make sure of it, said Tanya, who had returned with a bag of Vern's clothes. I've extended my stay for another 2 weeks. You don't have to do that, Vern protested. Your family is fine, Tanya interrupted. Jeff's parents are helping with the kids. And you're my family too, Dad. I'm staying until you're back on your feet. The next morning, Vern was wheeled out of the hospital to find not just Tanya and a car waiting, but a small crowd of well-wishers. Mrs. Grayson, Marcus, Darius, several former players, and even Doug from property management. What's all this? Vern asked. Support system, Jordan said from behind his wheelchair. I told them you're too stubborn to take care of yourself, so they volunteered to help. Mrs. Grayson stepped forward. I'm making dinner for you 3 times a week. No arguments. Marcus grinned. And I'll be driving you to and from the community center for your coaching sessions. One by one, they explained how they would help. Grocery deliveries, medication pickups, company during recovery. Vern was overwhelmed by their kindness. I don't know what to say, he admitted. Say thank you and accept the help, Jordan advised, quietly. Remember what I told you about my most important lesson from you? About trusting my shot? Vern nodded. Stop thinking. Start shooting. Exactly. Stop thinking about whether you deserve help or not, and just accept it. These people care about you. Let them show it. 3 weeks later, Vern walked slowly into the community center gymnasium, leaning less heavily on his cane than before. The kids were already there, running drills under Marcus's direction. When they saw Vern, they stopped what they were doing and burst into spontaneous applause. Deshawn broke from the group and approached Vern. Coach, you're back! I am, Vern confirmed, and I hear you've been working on that jump shot. Every day, Deshawn said proudly, just like you told me. Want to see? Vern nodded, and Deshawn grabbed a ball from the rack. He dribbled twice, set his feet, and released a perfect jump shot. The ball arced through the air, elbow in. Good follow-through, just as Vern had taught him, and swished through the net. Beautiful, Vern said, his chest swelling with pride rather than pain. As practice continued, Vern sat on a folding chair at the side of the court, calling out instructions, making small corrections, praising good efforts. This was where he belonged. Not in a cold apartment counting saltines, but here, passing on his knowledge to the next generation. After practice, as the kids were leaving, Jordan appeared in the gymnasium doorway. He watched silently as Vern gave Deshawn some final pointers on his defensive stance. Looking good, Coach, Jordan said when the boy had gone. Both of you. Feeling good, Vern replied. Better than I have in years. They walked together to the center's small cafeteria, now empty after the day's activities. On a table was a set of architectural drawings, the latest plans for the Vernon Wilkins Basketball Academy. Construction starts next week, Jordan said. Want to see the changes we made based on your suggestions? As they reviewed the plans, Vern felt a profound sense of peace. From the depths of despair to this moment, it had been an incredible journey. The hunger, the cold, the fear of homelessness now seemed like a distant nightmare. You know, Vern said, looking up from the plans, when I was at my lowest, I thought my life was over, that I had nothing left to give. Jordan listened silently. I was wrong, Vern continued. Sometimes the game looks finished, but there's still time on the clock for one final shot. And you made it, Jordan said with a smile. No, Vern corrected. Him. We made it. The greatest assist led to the final shot. That's how basketball works. That's how life works. Outside the community center windows, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. Inside, two men, one who had become the greatest player in basketball history and one who had helped him on that journey, continued planning for a future that would touch countless young lives. The final shot had fallen perfectly. Nothing but net. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Where are you listening from today? Let us know in the comments below. For another inspiring story that will move you just as much, click the video appearing on your screen right now. Your support helps us continue sharing these emotional journeys of redemption and hope.